All right, what's going on there, fellas? I've committed to every Sunday, we're going to try to do a full dedicated Q&A video. I'm going to keep sprinkling in random questions into like the videos during the week where I might include some of my training, some hot takes, kind of the mixed bag type of thing. But I decided I would set aside 30 minutes every Sunday, today's my rest day, to sit down and answer you guys' questions and hopefully help you with your efforts to get big and strong. Don't have much to do today outside of my regular work in terms of coaching. I've got a steady state cardio session. It takes me about 45 minutes or it takes me exactly 45 minutes. And then I've got my mobility work. So a little bit of time free today. So every Sunday, we're going to try to get this done. We'll try to hold me accountable here. So we're going to get straight into you guys' questions. Roughly 30 minutes on the clock. We're going to get through as many as we can. Might be all of them. I don't know how many we got this week. So the first question is sort of a meta question, but has there been anything you learned through being a part of the YouTube lifting community that changed the way you train or your results in some meaningful way? I guess that depends on what you mean by being a part of the YouTube lifting community, right? Me as a video creator, I guess I can call myself that nowadays. I don't think being someone who participates in terms of making videos, I don't know off the top of my head if there's anything I've taken away from that's changed my approach to training, because I was already at least reasonably far into forming my approach to training. And obviously I'm pretty open-minded and things change with time as they need to, right? You can have a method that works really well until your needs change, right? Maybe really leaning into your posterior chain training takes you from point A to point B, but to go to point C, we need to start shifting our attention up elsewhere. Maybe we need to focus more on the upper back, right? So methodologies change with time. We're going to be drawing inspiration from a lot of people. It's not a static thing, but I don't think being somebody who makes videos has really impacted that. But if we're saying a member of the YouTube lifting community, meaning a guy who watches videos, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos on lifting. I would go so far as to say I've watched a ridiculous amount of videos on lifting. And I would say a lot of the things I know today are from either listening or observing videos with high-performing athletes or people I think are quite smart that share my goals. So I guess in terms of being a member of the community in that you guys know who I am, not really, but being just a guy who watches YouTube videos on lifting, God, I've learned a ridiculous amount. I would say I've probably learned about as much from that as I've learned from anything. You know, back in the day, I would always watch every time Mark Bell would have a guest on what was it called? Mark Bell's old podcast, whatever that was called. Every time he would have a guest on, he would have a different person that would talk about their training methods. I would really keenly listen. Every time it was a lifter that I thought really had their shit together, I would listen and I would take notes and all the old Juggernaut videos. And geez, there's been so many videos that have been very influential to how I think about training. You know, I really like Brian Alsruhe. I really like the new meta of every competitive strongman having a YouTube channel as a alternate revenue stream. I would say I've learned a ridiculous amount if we count that as being part of the YouTube community, I guess. And it's impacted my training in probably more ways than I could count. The next question is, how important is scapular positioning, retracting and depressing during the bench press? Is it any safer or stronger than neutral or slightly retracted and depressed shoulder blades? So I guess let's try to break this down a little bit. How important is scapular positioning? If we are talking from a bodybuilding perspective, not really my forte, I would assume it has some importance. You can kind of listen to Mike Israetel's theories on that about how we're trying to draw the sternum upward, which kind of comes along with some amount of retraction and depression of the scaps to effectively load the stretched position of the pecs. So I'd assume it has some importance, though, you know, you'll hear some people in the bodybuilding space advocate for a little bit more of a dynamic scapular position where we're a little bit more protracted at the top, more depressed at the bottom, whereas in traditional powerlifting spheres, we hear more of a locked in whole time, back and down as hard as we can. Now, what we're cueing and what is actually happening isn't the same thing, and that's why this discussion gets a little bit more nuanced, right? So is it any safer? No, there's no formal literature to suggest that anything is inherently safe or not safe, but I will say that a lot of people find their shoulders take a lot less of a beating doing the bench press once they develop better scapular control, once they manage to really depress the scap. I would say, you know, you could probably make an argument that the scapular depression is more important than the scapular retraction. if you maximally retract, we're almost taking away from that that scapular depression. So it's like if I was going to focus on one, I most would focus on the down more than on the back. So is it safer? As far as the literature goes, no. We can basically just build up position-specific tolerance as long as our load selection is good, as our progression over time is good. It shouldn't on paper be any safer or more dangerous, but I will say there's a lot of people that have attempted to load management, and they found that once they manage to master this control of their scaps, retract, depress, turn that press into a slight decline, their shoulders tend to feel a lot better. So I think it can be a strategy for keeping these shoulders healthy. Stronger, I would say that control of the scaps is a massive part of technical proficiency in the bench press. Now, whether we're cueing slightly retracted and depressed shoulder blades or maximally is going to vary from person to person, right? Because like we talked about, what you're cueing isn't necessarily what's happening, right? There will be some people that they're cueing back and down as hard as they can, but you can still see that they have some protraction, retraction happening throughout the course of the rep. Because some people will critique cueing shoulders back and down and say, oh, you're interrupting like the natural scapulohumeral rhythm, right? For our humerus to move, there's supposed to be a certain amount of scapular movement alongside that. If we restrict the movement of the scap and we move the humerus, we could be giving ourselves shoulder issues. Well, the thing is, just because we're cueing a static scapular position doesn't mean that's actually what's happening, right? So some people will cue this maximal retraction depression and they'll never get any issues, and they probably seem to have whatever we could define as this very vague term of good scapulohumeral rhythm. Other people, if they cue that maximally, they do find their shoulders get a little junky, and they need to maybe decrease how hard they're cueing it and allow for a little bit more protraction, retraction, or a little bit more of a neutral position. That being said, I'm big on the scaps down. Basically, regardless of training goal, I think depressing the scaps is probably a pretty decent idea. But I hope I kind of answered your question. If I did not, please let me know. What specifically is you want to know, and I will be more than happy to take another stab at it on next week's Q&A. Very niche question, but do you have any experience coaching or training anyone who had kyphosis? I find as I get stronger, it feels like it impacts my ability to safely progress further. Do you have any takes on how this could be mitigated through strengthening specific areas, mobility work, or exercise selection? I would say I probably have coached a couple of people that could probably fall into that criteria of being diagnosed with kyphosis. But that being said, things you don't necessarily fundamentally need to correct these things, right? There are very high level listeners with scoliosis. Maybe they have to regulate their training loads the same as we all do. Maybe their regulation looks a little bit different than ours. But we can basically outfunction our form on any level. I'm not in the position to tell you what I think in terms of exercises to reinforce positioning and whatnot, but I would say that things don't need to be inherently unique. Maybe you need to take something a little slower, or maybe you need to prioritize something a little bit more, but I don't think your program needs to be extremely hyper-specific to you, the guy with kyphosis. That being said, this is outside of my wheelhouse. I am not a physical therapist, and I would probably, if you can, find a physical therapist that is familiar with resistance training and strength training. And they're probably going to have a lot more nuanced view rather than just tell you, oh, just avoid X, Y, Z. They might tell you how they feel you can ease your way back into it. Things you kind of need to be doing year round to kind of keep yourself in a good state. But I don't really think you should be looking for something hyper specific to your kyphosis. That would just kind of be my general thoughts. Again, if I did not answer what you're asking, please let me know and I will take another stab at it. My friend Adam said, thoughts on specificity of lower body accessories, like how necessary is it, i.e. belt squats versus leg press or hack squat for more direct carryover to the squat pattern. Now, this is actually a really, really good question that I put a lot of thought into myself. A couple of years ago, there was this huge wave in powerlifting of belt squats are the shit. Nothing compares to belt squats. Good fucking luck trying to get your squat stronger if you don't have a belt squat. And the argument was that the belt squat was so much more specific to the squat that it was immeasurably better. Now, I always thought that was a bit weird. How specific can something be that isn't axially loaded? The positions people are in their belt squats don't look that much like their squat. We're not loading the posterior chain in a way that we would in the squat. Yes, we can take the same stance. Yes, we can take the same depth, which is cool. And we have this little bit greater degree of freedom of movement to allow us to mirror our squat a little bit more. But let's not be fooled into thinking that the belt squat is the most specific thing in the world, especially some of the guys that were touting the benefits of the belt squat. If you watched how they belt squatted, holy shit, they're just yanking themselves up by the handles. It's nothing like their squat. So this idea that the specificity is inherently super high for something like a belt squat and super low for something like a hack or a leg press, I don't really buy into. We're not going to get that much skill transfer. We're much more heavily demanding on the quads rather than the posterior chain. That can almost be a benefit of the leg press sometimes, is we can strike this balance between training the quads and the hip extensors on a leg press, whereas most of the time when we're belt squatting, we're preferencing towards those knee extensors a little bit more, which can be a benefit if you're someone whose posterior chain always takes over when they squat. The belt squat can be the best assistance movement in town because it's forcing you to bias into those knee extensors. But I wouldn't necessarily buy into the hype that like it's a night and day difference in specificity. There's people who have built up tons of general good leg strength on all of them. And the big thing I look for is not necessarily the specificity of the movement, because all of them are very limited in that regard. I look for the specificity and range of motion. So are we taking the ankle, the knee, and the hip to a depth that looks kind of like our squat? That's where I kind of care, right? So it's like if your leg press at your gym, if you film it from the side, you turn it sideways, the maximum range of motion you can get out of it looks like it would be a high squat. That might not be my favorite option. Whereas like most belt squats, we can take to a competitive level of depth. And that means we're training the squat relevant joints through a squat relevant range of motion for our hypertrophy work, which is A-OK, thumbs up. That's a good thing. Hack squats, generally we can always achieve a position where our hip crease falls below the top of our knee, so it hits that criteria. That's the biggest thing I look at first, is when we're doing this extra squat pattern work where we're not being limited by our lower back. Basically, our legs can handle more of this squat pattern volume, or we're extending at the knee and the hip and the ankle, but our low back couldn't. We're going to use one of these machines to kind of run up that extra volume and hypertrophy our lower body in a way that's relevant to the squat. Cool. The first thing I like to look at is, okay, well, can we load ranges of motion for all three of those joints that are pretty similar to what we would on the squat, progressively overload those from sets of anywhere from like 6 to 20 reps. If you can do that, I would say the results we're going to get are going to be pretty comparable. Now, some people will find that there's a subjective effect of like, oh man, when I'm doing the leg press, I do notice that my posterior chain stays strong like my quads and it goes well. Or vice versa, if you're someone whose quads are habitually lagging behind, you're like, yeah, I feel a little bit worse when I'm leg pressing as opposed to something like the hack squat or the belt squat, which would be a little bit more demanding on the quads, maybe a little bit greater range of motion at the knee joint. You might find subjectively your preferences between them, but I don't really buy the argument that there's a hierarchy between the three for all people. There might be a hierarchy for the three for a specific person, but not necessarily for everyone. Those are kind of my thoughts on it. When/what circumstances do you use a belt? Are there any advantages to having training blocks without a belt for big compounds? So long story short, the context where I wouldn't use a belt is if my goal is to be good at lifting without a belt. And the context where I would use a belt is if my goal is to prepare for a lift with a belt, right? So using a belt is a skill. We would probably like to practice that skill a good bit. That's kind of the first and foremost thing. So it's like if my goal is the maximum 1 rep max squat and I'm going to have a belt on, I will probably train the majority of the time in a belt. Now we can use beltless work as a self-limiting variation, and we can also use beltless work as a variation that is more demanding on the torso if we identify that to be a weak link in the chain, assuming we are pretty skillful at the use of the belt. So I would say that's the simple answer is it just depends on your goal. The more complex answer is, okay, well, let's say our goal is maximizing our lift in a belt. Are there periods of training where we might take the belt away? There's no cut and dry answer. There are good lifters that do both. Some guys swear by reduced equipment work, made their midsection that much stronger. Whereas some people take away the belt for a whole training cycle. They think they've come up with this mastermind idea. The number of guys I've seen do this exact same thing where they're like, well, I'm just not going to wear my belt for the whole training cycle, and then I'm going to put it on when I max, and I'm just going to level up. I'm going to be so much stronger because I got strong without the belt, and then I add it back in. And ability to use the belt has detrained. So they're not getting as much out of it at the end as they could have had they practiced in the belt and trained with a little bit of extra weight by using the belt, right? So it can be reduced equipment work can be overdone, right? Does it have a place? Largely personal preference. There are good lifters that basically all of their working sets are done in their belt, and nothing ever seems to happen to them. Now, if you're egregious at lifting without your belt, it might indicate, hey, okay, cool, our skill at using the belt is pretty high. You might come up with your own hypothesis and say, okay, maybe I'm so bad at lifting without a belt, it's indicative of some kind of deficit in positioning or something. So maybe we're going to work on that on a secondary day as a variation and see if it carries over to our belted number. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to diagnose. On the other side of the coin, if you can lift just about as much as you can with a belt, without a belt, that would indicate, okay, cool, we're way too good at this variation. We're probably underskilled at using the belt. So that would kind of be my thought process is, long story short, if the goal is to lift as much as we can with a belt, the majority of the training is going to be in the belt. If the goal is to lift as much as we can without a belt, we're going to be out of the belt most of the time. Now, if our goal is to maximize our lift in the belt, sometimes there's a time and a place for a variation by taking the belt off, whether that's to reduce the absolute load on the bar for periods of training, or if we suspect that it's going to be addressing a weakness and it's going to carry over to our belted number because we already have a reasonably high level of skill at bracing using the belt. And if we're really good at lifting beltless, we probably should be using our belt more often to get more skillful at getting weight out of it. Next question. Do you follow the school of thought that beginner lifters, years 1 through 3 training, should play into their strong points for strength, relying on strong points to become stronger, or they should focus on attacking their weak points once they become apparent, as to allow their strong points to shine? Basically, if someone's chest responds really well to training, but their triceps are weak by comparison, should they dump more resources into their already strong chest to help them move more weight, or should they dump more resources into their triceps to allow their chest to act at full capacity? So I would always advocate for a well-rounded approach. I don't think favoring away from a weakness and allocating even more recovery economy to your things that come naturally to you, that's okay. Like, let's say you get into lifting and you notice you're good at deadlifting. It's very common for people to then start to identify themselves. I'm the deadlift guy. I'm the deadlift guy. I've got a poverty bench, but I'm the deadlift guy. And then suddenly they're shoveling more and more of their limited training economy into each week into getting better at that lift that they're getting a little bit of attention for, that their friends know they're the deadlift guy. And they spiral into being a really good deadlifter because they had this natural propensity for it, and then they dumped a bunch of training economy into it. That's cool. That seemingly will get you some sponsors potentially. You could be a one lift wonder. You can get a bunch of Instagram followers and only post that lift. My philosophy when it comes to strength training is I would always like to be a well-rounded strength athlete. So my philosophy has always been to do the opposite, regardless of the level of the lifter. If you notice that something comes naturally to you, we almost want to use that to get away with doing a little bit less, to allocate more of our training economy towards whatever doesn't come easily to us, whether they're a beginner or an advanced athlete. I'm big on this chronic pursuit of well-rounded strength development. So in this case, no, I wouldn't double down and keep pushing the chest stronger and stronger and stronger. I would use a reasonable amount of volume to continue the chest getting stronger, right? We don't want to completely neglect our strengths. We should probably aim to still be doing enough to get them better, but we can get away with doing less to keep it moving better, right? And allocate those more towards our weaknesses. And I think in the long run, usually that will lead to a higher level of performance in my experience, rather than putting off that weak point until you're advanced arbitrarily and then having to play catch up. Usually people that did that end up regretting it and wish, God damn, if I had just started prioritizing my triceps from the start, I would be benching more right now. So that would be my thoughts on the matter. Next one, how often would you repeat a main lift in a week? Let's say you're squatting and one day you do front squats and the other you do back squats. Could you get away with a 2x of whatever squat a week? Or in the long term, would that lead to overuse? You could. Your body can adapt to a pretty wide variety of working ranges, right? Now, the big factor you're not mentioning here is, if we only do a little bit of squatting each day, we can absolutely jack the frequency super high. Now, if we do a ton of squatting each time we squat, that frequency needs to come down. So it's a balancing act. If you really wanted to squat 4 times a week, we could absolutely find the amount of squatting per session that would let you do that, right? So I guess the question a lot of the time isn't whether you can, it's whether you should. And that just kind of comes down to, well, what other goals do you have to juggle within your training? Would that really bite into your ability to work on your other goals? Whether it would lead to overuse is super multifactorial, right? We look at our recovery variables. We look at the efficiency of our technique is going to impact how much a given set of squats is going to tax our body. Someone who's very mechanically efficient can probably get away with doing more of those sets than someone who's mechanically inefficient. Genetics play a role, limb length plays a role. Squats for someone with very long femurs are going to be a lot more systemically taxing than squats for someone with a short femur, right? So there's no cut and dry XYZ frequency is going to lead to overuse, especially if we're not even talking about how much squatting is being done per session. So those are my thoughts. If you have a more specific follow-up, just let me know. Happy to help you out. How many strength exercises on average would you push in a given strength block, i.e. 2 upper strength movements like push press and barbell row, and 1 lower being squat? That is a good question. I definitely get what you're getting at, because there's a certain point, and I see people do that, where they're chasing too many performance metrics and they end up getting really negligible, if not any progress on all of them, because they're not doing enough of any one kind of class of movement, right? So if we spread ourselves too thin, we're not going to see this forward rate of progression. We talked about earlier, though, is if we specialize into one of them, we might not be becoming the well-rounded strength athlete we hope to be. Now, and the other thing that can kind of make this even trickier is there's going to be some overlap between them, right? We could say, okay, well, I've got 2 different pushing performance metrics. One of them is an overhead press and one of them is a close grip. Well, there's going to be some carryover between the 2 of those. There's a lot of overlap in musculature between the 2 of those. So it's like, I guess it just comes down to your goals, right? If you have only one goal, one movement being our main priority, and then everything else is kind of assistance work that revolves around that one thing, that's probably going to produce the greatest result possible for that one lift. If you've got 2, okay, we're still going to get probably extremely good, because it's not very many things to split our focus between. So I guess the question is, at what point is it too many things that we're chasing in a week? And that's a really good question. Again, it kind of depends on the person, how much time the person is spending training, their recovery capabilities, the number of tasks that they're able to tackle in a week also comes down to their ability, ability to focus on, okay, now my focus is this task. Now my focus is this task. It's really multifactorial. I would say you'd be really selling yourself short with anything less than 3 main tasks in a week. I think anyone can do that. And anything less than that, I think you're not going to become very well-rounded. You could probably make an argument just like upper body push, upper body pull, hinge, squat. Maybe we should start with 4 being the minimum, right? 3 to 4, I guess for a power lifter, that'd be 3. For someone who's more of a general strength training enthusiast, who's a little bit more upper body pulling than might be necessary for powerlifting, that could be 4. I would say that's the lower end. Right now, could we push that up towards 5, 6, 7, 8? Yeah, we could. Maybe the higher that number is, the slower our progress is going to be. And to see good progress, we're going to need to be a real stud about, okay, our technique on everything is dialed in, our food, our sleep, blah, blah, blah. But it's probably a range. I'll probably be working on anywhere between 4 and 10 tasks per week at any given time. Obviously, I see a lot faster rate of progression on the 4 when I'm doing 4. And I see a little bit slower when I'm doing 10, but sometimes that's necessitated by, okay, I've got these central strength training motions that I like to work on year round, and then I've got some specific events for the upcoming show, right? So I guess those would be my thoughts. Not the most cut and dry answer, but unfortunately, usually the answer isn't cut and dry. Now, the next one, in your video, recommended learning resources, parentheses, nutrition, parentheses. You recommended watching every Juggernaut training systems video from 6 years ago to about 3 years ago. Are the videos before or after that time frame worth watching for learning about programming as well? Yeah, the ones before that, when Chad Wesley Smith was more active as a competitor himself, they're way less polished, but the ideas are really good. Very smart guy, applying some more traditional sports periodization type principles from his track and field background and from learning about weightlifting, applying those principles to powerlifting, which at the time was revolutionary. Chad Wesley Smith, a long time ago, came out and said, hey, I don't think conjugate is a good idea. There's this cool thing called specificity. specificity, right? And he got crucified. Everybody told him, well, all the strong guys are doing this. And it was an example of people being at where they're at potentially despite their methods, not because of, right? Because look at us, fast forward 10 years, and the vast majority of athletes are not using a conjugate-based approach within powerlifting, right? So that argument of, oh, all the top guys do it, at that point was a logical fallacy. It was just a call to authority, which didn't really hold any weight past that, right? So, and he was kind of on that avant-garde of applying more of a high specificity approach, you know, a little bit more of this focus on periodization, like in having blocks dedicated to different physical qualities. And he had his thoughts, he had his ducks in a row really early. So even the really old Juggernaut videos are pretty goddamn solid, in my opinion. The more recent stuff, you know, Chad's definitely got his foot a little bit more out the door when it comes to powerlifting, kind of putting things off onto the Juggernaut AI, which that's scalable. Let the man make his money. He's contributed more to powerlifting than just about any of us will, so more power to him. But I find the more recent videos a little less helpful, but still some of the best stuff on YouTube even then. So I guess those would be my thoughts there. How to find stance width for squats. Seem to choose something that feels comfortable but also strong. I usually err on the side of pick something that's comfortable, kind of checks the fundamental boxes of what a squat should look like. Obviously, it's going to be different for you and me and he and she and all of these other people are going to have a little bit different squat, but there's going to be some fundamental criteria that the vast majority of us are adhering to. As long as you're adhering to those criteria, I would first focus on comfort and then just try to get it stronger. I find a lot of the time if you pick something that is in the short term strong, but it's uncomfortable, usually that'll lead to kind of some chronic issues with getting banged up. And you might be outperformed in the long run by the person that chose the thing that was slightly weaker off the bat, but it let them do a lot more training without getting banged up. Example for myself, early in my training career, I didn't have the kind of scapular control, and I didn't have like the level of bench technique to get away with a wider grip bench. I would chronically tweak my shoulder or my pec just a little bit, minor things here and there. Even though that was the stronger grip compared to narrow grip, I chose to go to narrow grip because I could do a lot more volume per week without having to worry about these chest or shoulder strains. And even though it was shorter in the long run, the ability to accumulate a lot more effective training without these setbacks made it stronger in the long run. Now, and down the line, you could always reassess and move to that other technique. If nowadays I have the scapular control, blah, 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 I probably could take my grip wider. I choose not to because the narrower grip has a little bit more carryover to my overhead type stuff and other pressing modalities. And my goal is to be a well-rounded presser, not just a bench presser. But if my goal was just competitive bench press, yeah, I probably would now take my grip out a little bit wider. But yeah, I would aim for this comfort first, you know, fit in those basic criteria. Sometimes if something is really goofy and it's comfortable, you might want to favor away from it. You know, there's a good chance that you don't need to have this hyper unique form. A lot of the time when people tell themselves that, they just want to do something unique, and it was actually not necessarily the best idea for them. I see that a lot of the time. You probably need to be pretty experienced in lifting on a more traditional technique to then branch off into something unique rather than starting with something unique. Because if you start with something super unique, there's a good chance you don't have the perspective to gauge whether that's actually better for you or whether it's just something that works in the short term. Those just kind of be my general thoughts. My pressing power has increased by being exposed to this powerful photograph in regard to what I put on the community tab. Hi, BQ. I like you. Paris says you're a cool guy. What generic program would you recommend for hypertrophy and progressing strength on the 8 to 12 rep range? As I understand them, I think a lot of Bromley's programs, you know, Bromley's really, really big on base building. I think Bromley's programs, I looked at them a while ago because somebody asked me what I thought, and I went and I looked over them to know whether to recommend them. And I think it was Kong and Bull Mastiff looked like damn good programs. I would feel very comfortable recommending Bromley stuff. Based on what you described as your goals, I think that's probably a pretty good idea. Full body 2 times a week programming, upper back and leg focus. That's not a question. Let me know if you have a question. That sounds like a great idea. Please give an example of minimalist strength training program. What are absolute musts for making my own minimalist strength program? How much volume per relevant muscle would be the bare minimum to make progress? So let's see. When we say minimalist, I assume we mean minimalist in terms of the number of exercises we're doing. And we could probably break up strength training into 5 major categories. You'll hear this kind of tossed around. It's a pretty central idea in a lot of people's different approaches. You've got upper body pushing, whatever plane. We've got upper body pulling. We've got squatting. We've got hinging. And then we've got carrying stuff. Whether you want to include carrying stuff in your program is largely goal dependent. You know, if we're some kind of athlete, I like to have weighted carries in there. Whether if we're a strong man, of course, we want to do our weighted carries. If we're training for like functionality, I do think the ability to pick up and carry something in front of us is a task that we can train to get better at, that we're going to call upon frequently in day-to-day life, that wouldn't be trained that well by just squatting and deadlifting, is a great tool for capacity. So I say we can have those 5. Whether you include that 5th one is kind of up to you. If the goal is just getting jacked, I think you could probably get away with not having the carry in there. So hypothetically, I would say 4 movements. Something for the upper body pulling, something for the upper body pressing, something for the squatting, something for the hinging. You could introduce a little bit of variety and say, okay, well, you know, I train upper body pulling twice per week. One day I do a vertical pull like a pull-up. One day I do a barbell row. Maybe I have a little bit of variety for my pressing. One day I do a overhead press. One day I do a bench press. Again, working in these different planes, but hitting these basic criteria. Maybe one day is a front squat. One day is a back squat. Maybe one day is a back squat. One day is a pause back squat, something like that. If we want to introduce a little bit more variety, same thing. Maybe one day is an RDL, one day is a deadlift, something like that to hit these main criteria. So I would say minimum, probably about 4 general classes of movements. Whether you want to bifurcate those classes of movements a little bit, kind of up to you. If you really are hell-bent on keeping things minimalist, it could just be those 4. I do like to have something for the abs and obliques, whether that be a plank, whether that be a hanging leg raise, whether that be a sit-up with your feet tucked under something. I do like to kind of include that in there, but it can be that simple. I could just say, yeah, for the most part, my training, I squat, I do RDLs, I do pull-ups, and I do overhead presses. And that's my strength training routine. Are there parts of physical development that might be left off a little bit? Yeah, that's kind of inherent to chasing minimalism. Is I'm sure you could argue there's plenty of muscles that aren't being maximally stimulated within that framework. But if minimalism is what you are pursuing, I would say, yeah, 4 general classes of movement. How much volume per relevant muscle would be the bare minimum to make progress? Well, if you do the bare minimum volume, you're going to get the bare minimum result. So if you're trying to get anything more than bare minimum returns, I don't think we should be looking for the absolute least we can do. It's more, well, what's the most I can do and recover from? Or what's the most I can do that doesn't negatively affect my day-to-day life? I would look more for those numbers rather than what's the least you can get away with. Because what the least you can get away with is probably going to vary a good bit from person to person, but those would be my thoughts. How do you get better at pull-ups without grease the groove? I found that I keep getting stuck around 6 reps on both chins and normal. Big one for me with my athletes that are kind of stuck in that like anywhere from 1 to 6 range is as soon as we can start adding a little bit of extra weight, we should. Even if it's for just 1, 2, 3 reps. If it's just holding a 5-pound dumbbell between your feet. You got a backpack with some textbooks. Track separate rep PRs with a couple of different small increases in weight. And that was what allowed my girlfriend Kirsten to get over her plateau she had at about 4 reps on the pull-ups a couple years ago. Is she could not get past that 4. But it was because she could do 4, she was able to do 1 or 2 with like 5 pounds added. And then she was able to do 1 or 2 with like 7.5. And she would track PRs. She's like, okay, this is the most I've done with it. Just like 2.5 pounds added. And it opens up some windows for, okay, well, I can't hit a PR at body weight today. That's gotten hard. I've kind of used up my initial newbie gains on that. But I can hit a PR at one of these small different increments in weight. So it allows you to kind of build some feeling of progression, some momentum. And just exposing yourself to these heavier weights is one of the quicker and simpler ways I've found to break through that plateau in that range. Is the second we can start training more maximal weights, we should. Tons of other ways. Obviously, grease the groove is a very proven principle. You know, you could say underweight pull-ups where we have some kind of assist to get in more volume is a phenomenal way to get over that plateau rather than just be stuck accumulating work with body weight. But overweight pull-ups, I think, is a very underutilized one. People think, oh, I need to be stronger before I add any weight. But it's like the second you can add weight, I would. Next one. What would be your thought process for programming a high-level untested lifter? Specifically, how would you go about picking numbers in training? Because their all-time bests are in a meet are likely from when they were using higher doses and more drugs compared to an off-season where they're probably cruising or maybe even off entirely. Well, there's two general approaches you'll see people take to this, and they both seem to perform quite well. Some people would just track a separate off-season versus peaked. Like, if you hear an untested lifter talk about, oh, this is an off-season PR, I'm not even peaked. You can kind of get, like, there's some things coming along with that peaking process that's heavily implied. I don't think they're trying to hide it, but there's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, like, yeah, you're not peaked. I get what you're picking up. And people would say, okay, well, I kind of track those as separate things. I keep my specificity pretty high. I'm still working on, let's say, the comp squat, bench, and deadlift in the off-season. And I know that if I reach an unpeaked personal best level of strength, that should translate to a new peaked best, right? So it's like, if we assume it's just a plus X amount, roughly, if we can build up that base, the peaked amount will follow. So you'll often hear someone like John Hack, who keeps his specificity quite high in the off season. He will talk about, this is like, I know if I get to the strongest I've been in the off season, I'm in a good spot for the next time I get into a competition prep with all the bells and the whistles. So that would be one, is just kind of have separate numbers tracked of, okay, well, I've got my competition PRs, which are under a very specific set of circumstances. And then I've got this more sustainable off-season PR, and I'm trying to reach new off-season bests. And just being able to kind of separate those two things and not being like, oh, but this is 50 pounds less than I do in like a peaked state. Okay, that's fine, but you're comparing apples to apples. You got to compare to last time you were in an unpeaked state. So that would be approach one. And approach two is to select close variations to let them work on something else and make the athlete not have to be confronted by the fact that they are maybe a bit off of that peak level strength. Ed Cohn notably would always do high bar, closer stance squats in the off season. Now, part of that is because it was building up a weakness, and part of that is it lets him focus on apples to apples comparison. He's only ever doing that in an off season setting. Is missing the bells and whistles of the meet prep. So it's like, okay, he's always looking for peak strength on that because he's comparing apples to apples. Some guys get really far away in the offseason with their desire to build general qualities. Someone like Josh Bryant is a big fan of off seasons looking very different than preps, working on a lot more varied physical qualities. And some people will just choose closer. They've got, okay, I've got my main meet prep thing, and then I've got this variation that's very close. It's got high level of skills transference. It's working on my weakness. And that's kind of what I do in the off season. I don't get super far away. Maybe I just pull on a stiff bar instead of a deadlift bar. And I know that every time I'm comparing a stiff bar number, it's all off season setting. Or maybe I'm hitting a high bar squats in the off season, as Ed Cohn did, something like that. I would say those are kind of the two differing mentalities, but they kind of hinge around the same thing of, okay, well, we've got this off season that should be compared to prior off seasons. And if we reach an off season level best, whether that's in a slight deviation in variations that are supposed to be targeting weaknesses, or it's a relatively specific motion, that should then, when we apply the same things we applied last meet prep, should correlate with a new all-time high level of performance. So those are kind of the two general schools of thought. Favorite UFC fighters, and give an analysis of how you think Jones versus Ngannou would go if it happened. I got probably too many favorite fighters to list. I got into the UFC watching a lot of Robbie Lawler, so holds a special place in my heart. Currently active guys, I really like Robert Whittaker. My analysis of Jones versus Ngannou, I think there's a very high chance that would be a absolute wrestling clinic from Jones. I think he's big enough. I think he's strong enough. I don't think Ngannou's stuffing those takedowns, and I think he's getting absolutely dominated on the ground. I don't even think I would go past 2-3 rounds, especially once Francis is gassed. I think Francis's striking looked, again, you could say, oh, well, Cyril Gane's a very, very, very good striker, so he largely neutralized it, but Francis's striking did not look to be at its all-time best. Yes, he was on busted knees, but during the stand-up portions of the Gane fight, he didn't look like the scariest man on the planet. Could that be a really good opponent neutralizing that? Yeah, for sure. But I reckon somebody like John Jones could also effectively neutralize that. People forget Stipe went a whole fight avoiding that dangerous punch and dominated Ngannou. Yeah, he got a bit better, but I also would contend that Jones is a lot better wrestler than Stipe. So yeah, I think always the chance he gets caught, especially when you got the nuclear option like Ngannou does, but I think 9 times out of 10, Jones would have taken that. Tips to improve efficiency. In training, recovery, meal prep, a lot of it comes down to like boiling down your process. What needs to get done and what's the best way we can get that done of quality, right? So always taking like a minimalist approach to warm-ups helps me a lot. We're like, okay, well, I've got this base of a very specific warm-up. Maybe I need a little bit on top of that, but I'm not going to build this infinite 30-minute long warm-up because that's just going to take away from time I could be spending on training that's actually going to drive physiological change. So minimalist view for warm-ups, but realizing that there are some things that are worth the 5 minutes they might take if they're going to improve the quality of the volume you put on the main lift. In terms of training, just being accountable for rest times is probably the biggest one. Working off of a timer if you need to, setting fixed rest times, picking those ahead of time in your program. Maybe if your coach gives you sets, you say, what's an appropriate rest time for this kind of work? You might say 5 minutes. What's an appropriate rest time for this kind of work? You might say 1-2 minutes. Working off a rest timer massively helps efficiency. Meal prep, super individual because everybody has a little bit of different diet, right? So it's like Max and I just cook 10 pounds of beef at a time and put it out into Tupperwares, and that improves efficiency. Broccoli slaw instead of having to chop up and cook my own vegetables is a big one, but those are just some that come to mind. How would you rehab high hip tendinopathy? Not a physical therapist. Have I ever tried giant sets in my training? Yes, I have. There are periods of time where I will do my assistance work in a giant set setting to try to develop my overall work capacity. And I think during those phases of training, it works quite well. What have you learned from Faz so far? I don't know, but I like his videos. Do you have a beard care routine? Nope. I just take showers. That's my beard care routine is I don't shave and I shower every day. What's all this talk about hydration? Haha. I literally maybe only drink Coke and whatnot and take a water bottle with me to go to the gym and feel fine. What is hydration and does it help that much? I don't mean to insult you, but you probably could be doing that better. Maybe you're really strong. Maybe you're not. When I wasn't strong, I could get away with having very poor hydration habits. Nowadays, I think I would probably hurt myself. If you are strong, more power to you, man, but I highly recommend you get on it. What is hydration? Hydration is just the amount of water your body is retaining, right? Like water can be retained in different places. Water can be retained like intramuscularly, which probably might help with force output, and at the very least is probably a valuable thing for reducing injury of risk. There's probably reason to believe that having insufficient water hydrating the muscles might correlate with higher rates of muscle strains and muscle tears, and higher rates of intramuscular hydration probably does correlate with improved performance to a certain point of like remedying dehydration. I find it helps a lot. If you want to continue drinking your water bottle and your Coke, that is totally okay. I'm going to keep chugging a lot of water because I find it makes a difference. Obviously, the key variables have different magnitudes for different people. Ronnie Coleman famously only slept like 5 hours a night and he seemed to be just fine. Whereas if Max slept 5 hours a night, he would probably be a cripple within 1 week of training, right? I don't sleep that much. Just genetically, it doesn't seem to click with me. I've gotten away with it. But if I slack on my diet, things go to shit. Some other guys, it's the sleep that matters. The diet matters less. So maybe hydration is less important for you, but I would contend that I think it matters. That's all the questions. Thank you guys for watching. Leave me your questions for the next ones down below.